Good evening. It is getting about time for us to get started. May have a few more stragglers coming in. That's okay. If you want to, go ahead and turn with me to 1st and 2nd Peter. That's where we'll be studying from this evening. Well, I don't know if it'll work for me or not, Tony. But if you can be making your way there, we'll have a few announcements before we open up with a prayer and a few people that we need to keep in mind and be reaching out to and checking in on. We have Larry Driver is having back issues and is not doing well, in need of prayers. Kathy Metter, that's Brandy Nichols' stepmother, is now back at home. Sue Birdwell has had COVID. John Caloney, stepfather-in-law of Reagan Crawford, has had COVID and is still in the hospital. And then Barry Whitaker is having some tests that are going to be ran in need of our prayers. Two that have passed away that we need to keep in our prayers, extend sympathy to the family, is both Ida Tucker and Joe Kemp. And on Joe Kemp, that funeral is going to be in Carthage at the Sanderson Funeral Home. I think that's what Jeff wrote. Visitation from 10 to 7 tomorrow. So keep that family in our prayers. Are there any others that we may have missed, or that I can add to the list or update on anybody? One more, Pam Hill is going to be coming home within the next few days. She's been in Salina, so that's positive. And then we definitely want to keep in our prayers all of those that have been impacted by the storms and the flooding that has especially hit eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina. And if you have any interest in helping make an impact there, there is a group going tomorrow to Churches of Christ Disaster Relief to help pack boxes that will be sent out. And so see Dawn if you have any interest in going with them. Okay, if there's not anything else, then we'll pray and then get into our study for this evening. Our Lord and our God, you are so good. We thank you for the ways that you reveal yourself to us every single day, the ways that you bless us, the ways that you care for us and watch over us. We thank you for blessing us with family and friends and church family. We thank you for the day and all of the fruits of it. May we make the most of our time together here, and may we leave here encouraged. May we leave here revived for the rest of our week. May we leave here eager and ready for heaven and eager and ready to meet you. May we do our best to lean on each other, love one another, encourage each other, as we never know what our brothers and sisters are dealing with throughout their week and throughout their lives. Also, please be with those that weren't able to be with us this evening, as we had a pretty lengthy list of people that are hurting, that are suffering, that are in need of your help, and that are looking to you and crying out to you. Help us to be the hands and the feet of Jesus and to comfort them in every way that we can. We ask for your guidance and your blessings in this study. We want your truths to be revealed and made evident and made known through your perfect word. We thank you so much for Jesus. Pray everything in his name. Amen. Okay. I'll set that there. Well, I guess we're now back to our regular programming, if you will. I know that we finished up our fall series, our Wednesday night series, this past, I guess, a week ago tonight. We're now into October, and we're now into a new series, and we're going to be looking at 1st and 2nd Peter, and hopefully that will get us through probably about the end of the year. It'll probably take a minute for us to actually get all the way through 1st and 2nd Peter, but that's okay. I don't normally teach. I was looking back, and it's been a really long time since I've taught a Wednesday night class through a New Testament book. Part of the reason for that is whenever we lay out and plan out a lot of our curriculum and teaching, a lot of the other adult class teachers take all the New Testament books before I can get to them, which is fine with me because I love being in the Old Testament. I love the studies that we've done through like Job and through Leviticus and Exodus and seeing the Levitical system, the sacrificial system. I've loved, before the fall series, we kind of walked through the geography, which was a whole lot of history that went along with that. So as you're remembering and recalling with me, it's been a really long time since on Wednesday nights we've been in a New Testament book. It's been a while since you've been in 1st and 2nd Peter as well, and I hope the best for this as we're going to kind of dive into this, and we're really not going to make it far this evening, mainly because it's a real introductory lesson to kind of get our bearings and our understanding of where we are and who is writing and why they're writing, and so we're probably only going to make it just a verse or two, and that's okay. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's start in the text. If somebody would, please just read the first 2 verses, and whoever has it, feel free to read. So 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Fantastic. So that's going to be our 2 verses for tonight, because that gives us the setting and kind of gives us the scene, the background for the entire letter. And we start with this very interesting phrase, which I'll try my little remote again and see if it'll work this time. Yeah, there we go. The exiles, the elect exiles, and the dispersion. I know that's not a phrase that we're used to hearing, and so I'll begin by asking, I don't know if it's probably been a while since you've been in English class, but I don't know if you've ever thought of a paradox or an oxymoron before, and you're like, what is a paradox or an oxymoron? It's okay, I didn't know either until I looked it up. It is 2 things or 2 words that actually contradict each other, but we often use them paired together. And so you are trying to think, I still don't know what you're talking about. A paradox or an oxymoron would be like when people say less is more. Well, those 2 things are the exact opposite of each other, but you know that sometimes when it comes to maybe dealing with people and situations, sometimes maybe when it comes to working on something, that it doesn't take a whole lot. Sometimes less is more. Maybe it's jumbo shrimp. I don't know if you've ever thought about that one before, but it's very ironic. And I guess everything's relative, right? The only reason that a jumbo shrimp is jumbo is because it's put next to regular sized shrimp. But those 2 things are the exact opposite of each other. I don't know if you know of any more, or if thought of any more, or any more have come to your mind. No? Okay. I think y'all are just still used to everybody preaching at you like for the last 2 months. But we'll get there. I'll get it back out of you. Something that just are 2 things that are polar opposites, but that Peter starts his whole letter with by talking to these Christians, is he calls them elect exiles. In 1 Peter 1:1, the people that he's talking to, he calls them elect exiles. And it's kind of reminiscent, especially when we start talking about them being in the dispersion, which we're going to work through each of those. We're going to talk through each of those, and hopefully they'll make sense to us by the time we're done tonight. It's kind of reminiscent of James, the beginning of James, because when he begins his letter, he uses the phrase in James 1:1 that he writes to the 12 tribes of the dispersion, or 12 tribes in the dispersion. And so you kind of have that same idea. But let's go back. Let's talk about being elect exiles for just a minute. What does it mean to be elect, or to be elected? Put it in other words. Okay, to be chosen. And when we think of that phrase, to elect, what normally comes to mind, and what do we normally think of? Huh? Yeah, we think about like the election process, and it seems like every time we turn around that there's another election. I know that there's a really big one every 4 years for president, but there's elections all throughout that time frame. You know, multiple elections each year, small and large. And so whenever we think about being elected, you think about this idea of someone that is chosen. And it's something that maybe, if you think about it, it's something that we have probably a better grasp and a better understanding of than the New Testament audience did. Why? Well, because they didn't get to elect anybody. There wasn't any leader that they had any say in whatsoever. It was they were in the middle of the Roman Empire, so it was a matter of who was in charge, and then if that person died, there was somebody that was next in line that was now in charge. So for them, maybe they had a little more distance between understanding what it means to be elect and what we understand for it to mean to be elect. So somebody that is elected is somebody that is chosen. And if you think about being chosen, I know that we call it this a lot of times, but it has a factor. Whenever you look at maybe middle school or high school and you had to choose superlatives for the yearbook. You remember that? And everybody had all those slips of paper and you went through and you wrote, you know, such and so for most athletic or most school spirit or most likely to succeed or whatever else it was. One thing that always gets said, right, about electing your school superlatives is it's all just what? One big popularity contest. This person didn't actually have the most school spirit, but they are one of, you know, the most popular people, and so they just kind of made their way in. I don't know if you got a school superlative, but I never did, and so I'm jealous of you, right? But whenever we think about this idea of being elected or being chosen, there is this factor of those that are elected, assuming in a perfect world everybody shows up and everybody votes. Well, the one that the most people like wins, or maybe the one that's the most popular is the one that wins. And so Peter begins by giving them this huge compliment from God's perspective, right? From God's perspective, you Christians, you are the elect. You are the chosen. You are the most popular and favored, right, in God's eyes. And I know that's really superficial because that's only partially true. I know that God shows no partiality. That's back in the book of James. But whenever we look at how this letter opens, he gives them just this wonderful ego boost by calling them the elect. But the moment that he boosts them up with being the elect, he smacks them right back down by reminding them they're not just the elect, they're also what? Elect. Exiles. That laser pointer comes in handy. They're also exiles. Now this kind of plays off, if we can go back and remember kind of our study where we studied through geography and a lot of history. What do we remember? What do we know? How does exile play into the story of God's people? I know we've slept a few times since then, but this will be back in June and July where we studied about this quite a bit. Where in the Old Testament were God's peoples exiled? What does it mean to be in exile? How does that play into their story? Okay, so one of the first times when we have Exodus is a great place to start because you have God's people that are not in the land that God promised them. They're not in the land of Canaan. They go into Egypt, which, keep in mind, we know from the story of Joseph, was God preserving them through famine. But they were not in their place. They weren't in their land. They weren't in their spot. And so they really were exiles. And so God brought them back up out of Egypt and into the promised land once again. Where else do we see God's people being exiled? I think I heard them all at the same time. But the one that I heard the most distinctly was Melinda's. So Babylon. Whenever you look at the story of God's people, you have at the very end of, both 2 Chronicles and 2 Kings. So that would be what, like 2 Chronicles 24? 2 Chronicles 36, 2 Kings 24, where you have Babylon coming in, taking Jerusalem, ransacking the temple, and they took all of God's people, and what did they do with them? They deported them. Took them with them back to Babylon in caravans. And that was the first real big exile. There was kind of a mini exile with Assyria, but it wasn't to the same extent. And so when you use the word exile, I think Jews, God's people that knew their story and their history, would have immediately, they would have gone back and flashed back to the Old Testament book of Daniel, where he is in Babylon, eating the king's food, not bowing down to Nebuchadnezzar, the writing on the wall, the lion's den, all that book of Daniel that we remember from being young, all takes place in exile. And it takes place in Babylon. Well, what makes it exile? We have noticed it with Egypt, we've noticed it with Babylon. What makes exile exile? In simple terms, where are you at? Or where are you not? You're not home. You're not at home. And I think when we ultimately look at what it means to be in exile, or for someone to be an exile, you think about not being in your home. Now, granted, when you think of exile, you may think of the group that you didn't know I knew existed, but I did. I had a grandfather, and he kept an exile CD in his truck everywhere that we went. Woke up in love. Oh, what a beautiful day. But when you think of exile, you may think of one thing or another, but for them to be in exile was to not be at home. Now, let's start to understand how those two things play together. The moment that one is part of the elect, part of God's people, part of God's chosen, right? What does that also mean? We sing the song all the time. 2 Corinthians 5. This world is not my home. And so what he's calling them and what he's reminding them in the way that he starts this letter and who he's writing to is, you are the elect and you are the chosen, but you don't get one without the other. In order to be one of God's people, in order to be one of God's elect, in order to be a Christian, in order to be a part of His family, we have to also accept in the same breath, in the same thought, in the same sentence, I can't be one of the elect and this world be my home. I can't be at home here and be one of God's chosen. And so Peter, right from the beginning, tells them and calls them, hey, you are elect exiles. And that is hard in a lot of ways, but the blessings outweigh the difficulties of being chosen by God, elect in God's eyes, and being having an eternity with Him. But what that means for the here and the now is that means we're exiles. And so what he's trying to show them, and as he's writing, we're going to look here in just a minute, we're going to get to our geography and see the area that he's writing to. These are not people that have actually been exiled, okay? These are people that are living where they've mostly always lived. Like, if they have moved, it's on their own volition. Nobody has forced them into exile or forced them to live where they're living. It would be the same as if you've been born and raised here in Lafayette and Peter wrote to you and said you were an elect exile. You're like, well, wait a minute. I'm living exactly where I want to live. I am home. I'm in the place that's always been home. What do you mean you're calling me an exile? What he's trying to tell them and show them is, believe it or not, spiritually, we are no different than all of God's people that were taken into exile in Babylon. Because it's easy for us to relate with something that we can, understand with one of the five senses. And those people in the Old Testament knew exactly what it was like to be uprooted and moved away from their home. And so what he's trying to make the bridge is, I know you haven't been uprooted and moved by anybody, but you're still in exile, not physically, but spiritually, because we've been uprooted and moved, our spiritual standing has been uprooted and moved from a place of condemnation to a place of eternity in heaven. And so when we are spiritually uprooted and exiled by God from where we started, a destiny and an eternity separated from Him in hell, to a place that is exiled somewhere different into a heaven with Him, then we have this sense of this world not being enough, and this world not being home, and this world not satisfying all of our longings and desires. And so we have these elect exiles of the dispersion. And when you look at the dispersion, connects right back to James 1:1. A few different takes, I guess, when it comes to the dispersion. For one, you can look at the very first dispersion in humanity's history, I guess, would be at the Tower of Babel, where God's people, they are dispersed. They are sent out. You could look at probably more likely and more recently in God's story, you have the dispersion of God's people, either A, throughout the Roman Empire as it was building and growing and emerging, but also B, from Acts 2 in the day of Pentecost. Like from the very beginning of the church in Acts 2, everybody scattered out and everybody went back to their own homes. And so it's very possible that some of the people that Peter is writing to, which we'll get to the date here in a minute, but it's not that long, just a decade or two, a couple decades after that day of Pentecost, that you have him writing and saying of the dispersion, tying back to, well, they were all in Jerusalem for Pentecost in Acts 2, but then what did they do? They all went back home. They all dispersed. And so as he writes to them, you have these elect exiles of the dispersion. Now, before we get to where he wrote to, I want to get to who is writing and us to talk about him. So who is the author? We have our good friend Peter, the Apostle Peter. I'm going to go ahead and tell you there is one typo and one correction that is on there. Before you find it, I'm going to go ahead and find it for you and tell you I'm wrong, so you can't tell me I'm wrong. Down there about halfway down, it says that Peter was the first to reach the tomb after Mary in John 20. That is a typo. Does anybody know who was the first to reach the tomb after Mary in John chapter 20? John was. Good job. So Peter would be the second after John, third, I guess, after Mary. But anyway, you get that. So there's the one typo. There's the one thing on that slide that's wrong. But we have the Apostle Peter. You notice the first thing that he does in stating Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. That happens a lot in Paul's writings, and a lot of it has to do with settling disputes. Okay, there maybe were different people in the church that were trying to establish a place of authority and say, you have to listen to how I'm teaching because I'm a so-and-so, or because, I have this rank or this title or that title, or I learned underneath this person or I learned underneath that person. That was a big problem in the early church. These people that even at times we see, like in 2 Corinthians, there's people that were claiming to be apostles that were never one of Jesus' 12. And so Peter opens up this letter by saying, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to first remind everybody that it is Peter, it's just good old Peter that's writing to you, but I'm one of the ones that studied at the feet of Jesus. Like, I'm one of the 12. And so it's kind of establishing a place of connection to Jesus, and I think a place of authority, like here is the reason why you should listen to what I'm about to tell you. I'm not trying to make you do anything for my benefit. I'm not trying to lead you astray. Like as the Apostle Peter connected to Jesus, I'm writing to you for your own benefit. And so you have this Apostle Peter, a few different things. Well, actually, I'll ask you, what are some things that we know and what are some things you remember just about the Apostle Peter and the life of Peter? Okay, he was very zealous. I guess we have that. Well, I guess I typed it and then, oh, no, I didn't. Yeah, middle. Defended Jesus at his arrest. I think about him cutting off the ear of Malchus is what I think of when I think of Peter being zealous. He's there in the garden. And again, every time we talk about this, I always point this out. We give Peter a hard time for cutting off the guy's ear. But if you will go back to the end of the chapter before that, Jesus very literally tells them there is going to be a time where they are going to take up arms. So Peter, and I don't have time to explain what Jesus meant or how that ties into the whole story, but I will tell you that Peter is not as misguided as we sometimes try to harp on him for. He thought he was carrying out what Jesus was saying. So anyway, yeah, he's very zealous. What else? Yeah, he walked on water, and that might go into kind of some of his zeal that led him to maybe sticking his foot in his mouth sometimes, but at other times seeing some of the miracles and power of Jesus, because you notice, that Peter was the one that cried out and said, Jesus, call me to you, or Jesus, tell me to come to you whenever you're in that Matthew 14, him walking on water kind of passage. Any others? Denied Jesus, absolutely, in the courtyard, and the rooster crowed. So that is a really big defining moment, I think, in Peter's faith and a turnaround in his life. Yeah, so we're actually going to look at that here in just a second. In Matthew 16:18, you have Peter or Jesus and Peter having a conversation. Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" And he said, "Well, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And he said, "That Peter, on this rock, Cephas rock, I will build my church." We'll talk about that here in a second. Any others? Yeah. Back to his zeal. He said he would die in defense of Jesus right before he denied Jesus. He had an opportunity, right, to put his money where his mouth was and die in defense of Jesus, and he did not do it. And yet is still forgiven and used by God throughout the rest of the Bible. Isn't that incredible? Okay. I guess the couple that I still have up here that we will talk about along the way. One, you have his calling by Jesus. You have Jesus healing his mother-in-law. You have him at the transfiguration, which is I think is really big. I don't know that we talk about that enough. That's one of those moments in Jesus' life where there are just some questions of what exactly happened here, what exactly does this mean, and what exactly does this look like? And I think that it's designed to be a little bit of a mystery, the transfiguration is. But I do know it's an incredibly significant moment, and probably the next most significant moment in Jesus' life after his death, burial, and resurrection. And so whenever Peter is one of the chosen ones to be present for that should tell us a lot, I guess, about the closeness and the connection between Jesus and Peter. One thing that we don't talk about much either is in Galatians chapter 2, there is a dispute between Peter and Paul over Jew and Gentile relations. Peter was a little bit of, I guess it's not exactly, it's more ethnicity than race, but in today's terms we'd call him a racist. Like he was catering and showed favor to Jews in the church over Gentiles, and that's something that he and Paul got into a dispute over that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 2. And then we have the last thing that we're going to get to in chapter 5 of 1 Peter is Peter's now an elder in the church. And so it's a really neat thing to kind of see that process from him denying Jesus to the turnaround to him being, the one to preach at Pentecost, to the turnaround to him now being, an elder in the church. And I love that. I love seeing that kind of full swing. Any other thoughts or questions on the author, on Peter?
So would that kind of show that example that you set our standards for elders?
Maybe so. Yeah, I think so. We maybe focus a little bit too much, right, on where we've come from or what our past looks like, when in all reality, I think the most qualified person to be an elder is the one that you see the most change in, the most dramatic work of Jesus in their life, So I would say so. I would agree with that. Any other thoughts, comments, questions, concerns? Yeah, that's something that we're definitely going to discuss. And at the end of the day, that's speculation. You know what I mean? But I think that what we're going to kind of start to see is that he's writing in a period and a moment of persecution, and that's very evident. So it is likely that in whether it's writing this letter or in just living out his life for Christ, he's in a spot and in a state where persecution is very, very obviously happening. So very possible. Yes. Any others? All right. Quote from some dead people. Who is the author? You have Origen is said to have said this, which you can see Origen lived from 185 to 253. But the only concrete evidence we have of Origen saying this is about another 100 years, later. Eusebius is the one who quotes him. So from 260 to 339 AD in his Histories of the Ecclesia. Ecclesia means church. Histories of the church. Eusebius is the one that writes this quote. Peter was the one on whom the church of Christ is built, against which the gates of Hades shall not prevail. That's a direct quote of Eusebius in the 200s. So either late 200s or early 300s. I'm not going to get caught up on semantics. I'm not going to get caught up on, what the church has to be called. I'm just telling you, here's a guy that lived in the 200s and 300s that just called it the Church of Christ. I'm not going to lord that over anybody, but I'm also not going to hide it either, that's what people in the early church fathers in the 200s and 300s were calling the church. But I want to talk about this quote. It's very important that we talk about this quote because I think that it ties in not only to our study of Peter, but it's a pretty big topic of discussion and debate. So notice what he says, what Eusebius says that Origen says, is that Peter is the one on whom the church of Christ is built, against which the gates of Hades shall not prevail. And that end tag makes it very obvious that he is referencing back to and quoting Matthew 16:18. So what do you see within this quote, within Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, how might this be understood or misunderstood? Yeah, so you have a play on the fact that, Peter, Cephas, means rock. He says, on this rock I will build my church. Absolutely. What other things jump out at you or do you see? There we go. And so this is a conversation that happens quite a bit, and it's different based on who you talk to and maybe what church or church tradition they are influenced by. But I think there is this look at, Peter as the one on who the church was built. And you have this idea of on this rock I will build my church. I think that it is only referencing Peter in part. I think Jesus is only referencing Peter in part by saying on this rock I will build my church. And I believe that connects directly to the beginning of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 2. Like that's a foreshadowing of the fact that Peter is going to be a part of just the groundwork, the foundational work of the church. But I don't think we can only talk about Peter when we're talking about the rock that Jesus is going to build his church on. What else is in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18? Mm-hmm.
But the word rock upon this rock was a boulder.
Okay.
The saying, the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, upon that boulder, that foundation, the church would be built.
And so I think we have the other half of that phrase, on this rock I will build my church. I think that in an essence it's a reference to Peter, but I don't think that Peter is the cornerstone of the church. And I don't think he's any more important or elevated than any of the other apostles. Right. He was the first to confess and to say that. Absolutely. And so that's where I think that the rock that is being referenced by Jesus, the rock that the church is to be built on, is not in any one person. I think it is in that belief, but even more importantly than that, that confession that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. I think that is the basis and that is the rock. And here's the reason why. The issue with having any one person as the cornerstone or the foundation of a perfect church is what? What's wrong with people? They're imperfect. So if Peter himself is the rock that the church is built on, then let me tell you, the church is in bad shape when Peter is over here treating Jews one way and treating Jews better than he's treating Gentiles. Church is in bad shape if Peter is the foundation, the rock, and the basis, and he's over here in imperfection, not living up to the very confession that he made. And so I'm not just harping on Peter, if any person, if any one of us was given the pressure of saying the church is going to be built on your shoulders, I am afraid we would come up short and we would fall and we would crumble. But Jesus is only nuancing Peter as the beginning or the rock or the pebble that the church begins on, because he is the first one to make that confession. He is the one to preach Jesus Christ crucified to the Jews for the very first time on the day of Pentecost. Like that is a big deal. I don't want to minimize that, but if we make Peter out to be everything, if we make him out to be the one true rock, well then, that the rest of the church is built on top of, well then Peter crumbles. What else crumbles? The entirety of the church. So how about we rather, let's look at the statement of Jesus, on this rock I will build my church, a perfect confession that is full of truth, that doesn't have an error or a flaw within it. You are Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God. If that is our rock, and if that is our foundation, and that is what everything else is built upon, that is a truth that will never falter and will never fail and will never crumble. And so looking at this phrase, I think that yes, these early, they're called early church fathers that lived in the 200s and the 300s. But these early church fathers that are talking about Peter, I think are giving him a sense of due respect. But I don't think that they're saying that the entirety of the church rests on Peter's shoulders, because nobody carry that. They're just simply saying the one whom it is built on, the one whom the church is built on, by saying he's the first one to make that great confession. He is the first one to ever preach Jesus Christ crucified on Pentecost. And so that is one big thing I guess we see about the author. Now for the setting, with what little time that we have left. I've got it. Next slide. What is the setting? So the area and the dispersion. We know this from the letter itself, that Peter writes with a scribe, chapter 5, verse 12. The scribe's name is Silvanus. That is actually a scribe that we have heard of before and can talk about at more length at another time. But that tells us that Peter was speaking this letter, and it was being written and being recorded, very similar to how Paul has done time and time again throughout the New Testament. And he has a connection to, if not a presence in, the Roman church. And so in chapter 5, verse 13, I'll just go over there. We'll go over there and read it. If you beat me there, go ahead and read it. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. Yeah.
She who is in Babylon, elect together with you, greet you, and so does Mark my son.
Perfect. And so that's the phrase, she who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark my son. And so some take that to mean that Peter is writing from Rome, from inside the city of Rome. And that's the most traditional belief. Like if you have a study Bible or commentary or whatever, they're going to tell you the most likely place that Peter wrote from is from Rome itself, because he says that he's at Babylon or in Babylon. And throughout this period into the book of Revelation, the church often references and connects Rome and Babylon. More or less because they're living in a time where Rome is the greatest empire to ever live and the greatest nation to ever exist. And what God's people have to be mindful of, maybe something that Americans need to be mindful of as well, is that even Babylon fell. Even Babylon fell. The only kingdom you're ever going to be a part of that's going to be eternal is God's. The only kingdom that's ever going to last forever is going to be God's. And so I think that's why, they keep reminding that Rome is Babylon, is because even Babylon had its expiration date in all of its greatness, and Rome did too, like you see where it's at now. So you have him possibly writing from Rome. There's no concrete evidence that it was written from Rome, but we do know that Peter had connection to the Roman church and did visit there from one point or another. Some think that it's really hard to believe with his heavy Jewish background and his heavy Judean fisherman background that he ever could really make a life for himself in the big city of Rome. I want you to kind of equate it to like New York City. You know what I mean? Like just pluck me up and drop me in New York City and see how long it takes for people to figure out that like he's not from here. You know what I mean? Like it's that same kind of idea of that would have been really difficult for him, for Peter to have made a long-term established home in Rome to be able to do this, but that's not to say that he wasn't writing from Rome. He was certainly writing from somewhere in the Roman Empire, because in their known world, everything was the Roman Empire. And the last thing that it points out is, notice, you saw what it said. What does he call Mark? My son in the faith. And so there's kind of this connection where Peter and Mark's relationship is very similar to like Paul and Timothy. My son in the faith. And that's the essence of discipleship, is they had somebody that they truly took under their wing and mentored. What big difference does that phrase make to our understanding of a different part of the New Testament? Where do we know the name Mark? I'm not trying to confuse you. It's as simple as it sounds. The Gospel of Mark. Have you ever wondered why somebody who wasn't an apostle got their gospel received alongside guys like Matthew and John who were apostles? It's because everybody in the early church knew that yes, Mark was the one writing it, but it was under the tutelage and influence and connection of the Apostle Peter. And you'll notice, and I can actually even show you some really neat different things in the Gospel of Mark that would support a connection to Peter, my son in the faith. So anyway, where we'll pick up next week is where they're writing to in that area. So we'll get to tap back in to some of our geography, and then we'll actually get into the contents of the letter. Thank you for your time and your comments. Good evening. We have just a few quick announcements before the invitation and the invitation song. Some that we need to mention and keep in our prayers. I know Miss Pam Hill is coming home within the next few days, so let's pray for them and that transition will go smoothly as she comes from Salina back here. Larry Driver is having back issues and isn't doing well. Kathy Metter is now back at home. Then Sue Birdwell has had COVID. John Coloni, that's the stepfather of Reagan Crawford, has had COVID and is still in the hospital. Barry Whitaker is having some tests ran and in need of prayers. Then Ida Tucker and Joe Kemp, we want to extend sympathy to their families at their passing. And then Dale Watson's brother in Texas also passed away. So there's some families that are hurting, in need of prayers. Are there any on the prayer list that I may have missed or accidentally overlooked? Okay, Bill Driver's been moved back to Knollwood. Oh, was it? Okay, good. Okay. Pat and Bill Driver both. So Bill was in Lebanon, so he's now been moved back up here to Knollwood, and then said he and Pat have both been in the hospital this last week. Okay. Any others? Then for up and coming events, tomorrow and Monday, the Churches of Christ Disaster Relief will be packing food boxes. If you are interested in going, it starts at 10 a.m., but if you want to go with Dawn, see Dawn, maybe you were encouraged. You saw the news last night. There was a news story and news coverage about the good work that they're doing down there with the Churches of Christ Disaster Relief. So talk to him if you would like to go and help pack boxes. They're going tomorrow, and they'll have to leave before 8 if you want to ride with him, and then they're also going Monday. So if you can go either of those days and want to go with him, see him. This Sunday, there's going to be a baby shower for William and Amy Ilya from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. in the fellowship hall. They're registered at Baby List and Amazon. Up and coming. For the month of October, there will not be any small groups. For the month of October, there won't be any small groups. Come the 20th of October, we will have our Soul Purpose Sunday. There has been a little bit of a shift and an adjustment, not on our part, but with some medical issues with Brother Dan Winkler. So he will not be able to be with us, but we will still have that Sunday, that focus, and that meal on October 20th. Then October 31st will be Trunk or Treat. That is on Halloween. Then for the youths, October 6th will be a Devo at the Gillums. That's this Sunday evening after service at Terry and Teresa Gillums. Then at the end of the month, October 25th through 27th, will be Fall Retreat at Taylor. Cost is $35. Registration is in progress. See Paul for any questions and or details. Okay, I think that's everything that I had. The song of invitation is 478. If you want to go ahead, mark 478. That'll be the song of invitation. And while you're marking that, I will tell you a story. So whenever I was a senior in high school, it was my very last year at church camp, and me and three of my buddies, we had just graduated and were about to go to college. And there was a guy that had befriended us that I didn't realize his grand plan at the beginning, but it became evident by the end of the week. His name was Jay, and he recruited us to play spades with him. But the catch was that Jay's job at camp was to be the night watchman, meaning that Jay slept all day and then woke up in the evening and had to stay up all night to make sure, people weren't sneaking out or doing whatever. He had his flashlight and his golf cart, and he made his rounds around the camp. We didn't put together the fact that, Jay got to sleep all day every day, and so we stayed up with him all night, every night for 3 or 4 nights straight. He convinced us that if we would count out our sleep cycles, so he said you have a sleep cycle every hour and 30 minutes. He said you can go on from an hour and 30 minutes to 3 hours of sleep if you'll time it out perfectly. And so we believed him, and so we did that. And so we learned how to play spades. It was as awful and as painful as you could imagine by the end of the week. But I'll tell you this, he is by far the best spades player I've ever played with. You know those people that you play with that you have 6 cards left in your hand and they can tell you what 5 of them are? That's him. One of the things that he taught us along the way, one of those late nights, crouched under the little porch light of a cabin with hardly enough light to play, is we got about hours and hours in, games and games in. He eventually looked at me and he said, "You're going to have to start sorting your cards differently." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Every night that we've played, you've held your clubs on that end of your hand. And so whenever you're pulling a card 3 cards back, I know you have 2 more clubs bigger than that. And I can't stop doing that, so you're going to have to organize them different so that I can't catch on." That's the kind of guy that he just had a mind for it, the memorization for it. And I want you to think about that thought of holding our hand the same every single moment of every single day, day in and day out. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 19. "They have become callous, and they have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. But that is not the way you learned Christ. Assuming that you have heard about Him and were taught in Him as the truth is in Jesus, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness." I want you to look back on the last 3 days that you have had of this short half week. How often do we get into every week and realize that we organize and sort and hold and do everything the exact same way as the week before? And it's exact same as what next week will be. And it's exact same as a week back in 1995. And we've had the same routines. We've had the same practices. We've had the same TV shows at night. We've had the same supper schedules. We've had the same everything. And we get into such a monotonous routine that sometimes we don't realize that we're holding our cards the exact same way time and time again. And yes, an all-knowing God knows that. But maybe for our purposes tonight, what I want you to focus on is a not all-knowing Satan knows and sees that as well. What can we do with the next half of this week to maybe do something a little bit differently to, as Ephesians 4 says, be renewed in the spirit of our minds, and to put on the new self created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness? I'm not asking for a lot and nothing crazy, but what's one simple thing we can do to break the monotony of how we've always done things and do one thing more in step and more in line with how our Creator would have us to do it if He were right here with us? Because I know one thing, and one thing for sure. Things will stay the same if things stay the same. And so when it comes to us, when it comes to our faith, when it comes to our prayer life, when it comes to the way we reach out to people, when it comes to the way we serve people, when it comes to the way that we love others, like if we don't change anything, nothing will ever change. But what if we make one small change with this next half of this week? What if we throw ourselves, throw our families, throw Satan for a loop and not do everything the exact same way that everybody else is expecting? Let's throw a wrinkle in there, but let's not do it for ourselves. Let's do it for the glory of our God. Maybe there's something that you feel like you have been holding on to and doing the same way for far too long, and you want to pray about that. I want us to be able to pray together. Maybe you haven't even had the opportunity to experience this newness of life because you have, verse 20, you've heard about Him and you've been taught in Him, but you have never made that decision to commit to Him. Commit to Him tonight. Make the confession that we talked about with Peter, that He is the Son of the living God. repent of that old person, to put on that new person and follow Him into the waters of baptism, never to be the same again and never to die, to go straight to an eternity after this life's over. If you have a need, let us know what it is as we stand and as we sing. Sunday, as we're going to continue looking at finding a fit and finding a place in God's kingdom. I'm really looking forward to that. I hope that you are as well. If you want to be studying ahead, do some study in Acts chapter 6 through 8 with the life of Philip. That would be beneficial to you. If there isn't anything else, Randy, would you mind closing us out in prayer tonight?